This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Today, we're excited to welcome Lisa von Biela to the Storyworks Roundtable. Yay! Lisa worked in information technology for 25 years, and she still claims there is no application she cannot break in testing. She left the field to attend the University of Minnesota Law School, where she graduated magna cum laude in 2009. She now practices law in Seattle, Washington. Lisa's first work was published in The Edge in 2002. She then went on to publish a number of short works in various small venues, including Gothic Net, Twilight Times, Dark Animus, Afterburn SF, and more. Lisa has published over 20 short stories, 3 novellas, and 4 novels, including The Genesis Code, The Janus Legacy, Ash and Bone, Blockbuster, Skin Shift, Broken Chain. This is an impressive introduction here. And her newest work, Moon Over Ruin. Welcome, Lisa. We're really glad to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we brought Lisa on to talk to us about genre fiction, horror, speculative fiction, and to be our resident expert tonight. Lisa, you categorize your work as dark fiction, and I'm not sure that's a genre we can find in a bookstore. Having looked at your work, I really want to call it speculative horror. I was thinking about this earlier. You know, you've got like slasher, killer type horror and supernatural horror with zombies or somebody who's possessed. And your type of horror, your work has more to do with biological or technological advances and the way corporations could or maybe are taking over the lives of ordinary people. So why don't you tell us something about dark fiction and how you like to categorize your work?
It might be a little bit of a cop-out instead of trying to put myself in one place or another, because certain people think of horror a certain way. It's not necessarily got a good name anymore unless you're Stephen King. So dark fiction kind of can encompass, and if you see in my longer works, they tend to be the techno stuff or the mythical stuff. And then my shorter works tend to be more traditional supernatural horror type things. So I kind of having my cake and eating it too.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. So is dark fiction a category that I'm just not aware of, or is it something you've kind of invented so you could avoid being put in that box?
I don't know if it's official. I've heard other people use it, but you're right. You go to the Barnes and Noble or whatever, and they're not going to have dark fiction. They'll probably have, if you were to categorize me in that way, you'd probably find my novellas on the horror shelf, and you'd probably find my novel length works on the thriller shelf.
Okay. That's interesting.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. So would you say a biotech thriller? Would that be kind of the subcategory of thriller as opposed to like espionage or...
Definitely, yeah, for sure. Kind of like Robin Cook sort of thing.
Okay. Very cool.
But with dark themes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I have one right now in with Dark Fuse that I delivered on Christmas per my contract, and it's not so much techno. It gets a little techno because there's a computer game involved, but it gets into the for-profit prison system, and I think that's probably the darkest thing I've ever written in my life. It's really, it's bleak.
Oh wow, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, Shane will probably love it.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So just so people know, Dark Fuse is your publisher.
Oh.
And wow, I can't wait. So many questions, but let's start with the basic one.
Okay.
What draws you to dark fiction and to these bleak stories in the realm of biotech corporations?
That's a good question. I've always, back when I was younger, the Stephen King, read a lot of Stephen King, watched the scary movies on TV and that kind of stuff. So I've always had that, and I'm a scaredy cat, so I can think of a lot of fodder just in my head. The other thing that kind of played into it, I was thinking about this in preparing, is Genesis Code, my first one. I actually wrote, because it was my first novel, I'd written typical horror sci-fi kind of short stories and said, I'm going to try a novel. And my boyfriend had just started with Microsoft at the time. And it was a very intense culture. It still is. And I remember him just, trying to learn all this stuff all at once. And I thought, what if they implanted a chip in people's heads so they could learn this stuff faster? And that was kind of the seed for that. And I found that at novel length, I kind of prefer a more technical, less supernatural type of thing. I don't feel, and maybe I'm wrong, that I could carry a supernatural for a book length.
Okay.
And then the other thing that got involved in this is when I was in law school, I was the biotech student representative for the ABA, for one of the committees. And I did this weekly, they called it the bio blurb, and it was these techno stories about biotech developments and legal issues and that kind of thing. And I had this really snarky tone. And I read these things and it's like, well, this development is really cool, but it could have this really dark side. And I used to tease the people I worked with. I said, oh, this is just novel idea after novel idea. I don't have time to even go to the bathroom being in law school, right? And so I just kind of kept them in the back of my head, and now they're coming out as books. And somewhat, being an attorney now, you see some dark sides of things. So a lot of the corporate darkness that's in my books now comes from that wellspring, if you will.
Right. Oh, that's such a great example of write what you know. Look at how all of these like horrible scenarios are coming right out of life for you.
They are, and then the worst part is they're coming true, because in Genesis Code I had the chip, and now DARPA has a chip, and they're experimenting. Ooh. Right.
So there it is. I've read Genesis Code. Yeah. Yep. I'm lucky enough to have a signed copy. So. Very cool. And of course, it's not enough just to put like a chip in somebody's brain to make them super employees. Something has to go horribly wrong.
Of course.
Of course. This is fiction.
Yes.
Yeah. Because that could never happen in real life, right?
Well, you were just saying it is happening. That's so much of this stuff. So what do you think, is there a timeline for this? Like you read about this stuff, you kind of get that seed of an idea, you write a book, and then you start seeing this coming up in news again. Are you noticing kind of a trend or a timeline for these things to come true?
It just varies. There's things with broken chain, and this is true science, that your gut bacteria influence your brain, and we have all this violence around us, and I'm starting to wonder, did I hit on something? Is there something in our diet that's causing these things? Never know.
Right. Okay. So in broken chain, something goes wrong with the food chain, with the cattle industry, with beef and dairy, right? So then what's kind of the crux of that premise? What did you hit on?
It was kind of a complicated sort of causality path, if you will. In fact, that one kind of took me a while to get it down where it wasn't too ridiculously complicated, but I also wanted to inject some real science, and there are really those kind of investigators in the I've forgotten the name of it.
Is it the FDA?
It wasn't the FDA. What was it? It was CDC.
Oh, right.
CDC.
Okay.
Yeah. God.
One of those acronyms.
Yeah. So there really are those investigative teams. If there's an outbreak of something or something going on, they will send people out. So that's real. I kind of fictionalized that. The gut bacteria aspect is a real thing. I made an interaction happen with a flipped amino acid, which could be completely, out of my head. But the what they were feeding the cattle, the soy that they were feeding the cattle, was GMO, and there was a flipped amino acid molecule, and that caused all these terrible things. And if you ate the, beef, and I didn't let the vegetarians off, so.
Oh, of course.
They got in trouble too with their soy, so every time I look at one of the patties, I go, But yeah, so it interconnected, and there are studies and they've done them in mice, where if they transplant gut bacteria, which sounds like such a stupid thing, gut bacteria, that's just, it affects mental processes, it affects mood, aggression, things like that. And so that's actual science. So I just twisted it in.
Right. That is very cool.
So what is it that you do in your head that takes that from, well, this is sort of science that is real, to being something that's going horribly wrong?
My twisted brain. So, what could go wrong with this? And, a lot of it is following the money, the profit motive, and we do things that are cheaper, faster, better, cooler, and maybe there's a problem there. Maybe something can be used in a wrong way. And that can happen with anything. I think I did an interview. It was a written interview with somebody once. And it's like, you look at cars. Cars are great things, but you can also kill with them purposely or accidentally. So everything has a dark side. I just like to exploit a novel about it.
Yeah. So what is your research process like as you're trying to follow the money, you said, or track down the science that you need, and then figure out what kind of twists you can create that are plausible? What's that like?
Well, I have an undergrad degree that is biology, so I was pre-vet, so I've got a little of that just built in, although it's now. And the internets are our friends. I look up stuff. It's easy. It's so easy. For Janus Legacy, I really had to understand Crohn's disease, and that was really easy. I had a professor in law school who had it, so I got to see firsthand what he was going through and surgeries and how terrible it was. And you just look on the internet, and I try to be careful about sources I use. I try to look at CDC type sources or Mayo Clinic, not just any kind of crackpot sources, so that I've got something there that has a kernel of truth, and then I go from there.
Right. Cool.
So you'd have trouble weeding through all the conspiracy theories, wouldn't you, as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you feel like that piece of the truth is really important to the speculative fiction part of your genre?
Personally, I do. I think there needs to be a seed of something to really be scary. Because to me, if it were 100% fantasy, it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of a cool story. But if there's a seed of reality and maybe this could happen, I find that much more terrifying.
Yeah, I do too.
I quite scare people with it.
Right. Well, and we're so helpless in either type of story, whether it's, a vampire or poisoned food chain. What do you do about it? You're kind of toast either way, but the plausibility factor in the speculative fiction, that is something that could stick with me for weeks. Every time I look at my soy burger now, I'll be worried about it.
I had myself nervous with Blockbuster because I creeped myself out with that one, and I told people this, that, you get a simple itch, just a plain run-of-the-mill itch, and while I was writing it and it was really in my head, I would have a momentary panic, like, oh no, and no, that's fiction. You're writing the fiction. You're in charge of that fiction. It's not real. Thank God. I hope.
Right. What is the premise of Blockbuster?
Blockbuster is... we have two big pharma companies, and one of them's family run and has some ethics, and the other one doesn't have many ethics and is really trying to shoot to the top and beat everybody out. And their way of doing it is to produce antibiotics that work on bacteria, MRSA-type bacteria that they created and let loose.
Right.
And so they've had their built-in profit center there, and then it gets out of hand.
Of course. Right. How could it not?
Yeah.
So I'm curious about that, though. What did you think makes something dark compared to, say, just a thriller or a suspense?
That's a good point. I mean, most of the thrillers I mean, they're not happy, my stories. Maybe that's why, but you're right. I mean, if you look at a David Morrell or whatever, he's got a lot of suspense, and I suppose you could call it dark, but he just, calls it a thriller and makes a bundle, apparently.
Well, would you say it's the overall mood of the piece, perhaps?
So, yeah, and maybe, I hate to say it because I don't think of myself this way, but maybe I've become that way. They're kind of pessimistic. I mean, the ends are not nice. They're really not.
Yeah. So let's say some of our audience would like to start writing dark fiction. What would you say are the guidelines or the traits that categorize something as dark fiction?
Probably taking a dark view and maybe, ascribing less than wonderful motive to different entities or characters or whatever.
Yeah. Are your protagonists typically underdogs? Is it usually a David and Goliath type story?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. I'm thinking back, oh, yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Interesting.
And the poor guy in Genesis. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
The poor guy in Genesis Code, it was actually kind of a difficult thing to write. And I think maybe one Amazon critique kind of called me out on it, is the protagonist didn't really know he was being screwed over, basically, for a good portion of the book, which is, how do you have a protagonist fighting against something that he doesn't even know is happening to him? And, I could see the criticism there,
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You'd mentioned that all the endings are pretty dark, sad. So do none of your protagonists ever have the happiness at the end of the resolution? Are they all at the end?
They're all
yeah.
Actually, Incidental Findings, that is supposed to come out this summer sometime, it's very different than my other ones. I have two protagonists. They're both young female attorneys. It's still a biotech type thing, so it's a medical and a legal thriller. And they not only survive, they do okay. And the bad guys, get their comeuppance. And I was kind of writing that one with the hope of perhaps Nikki becomes a series character, but we'll see. I want to see how it's received before I put a lot more time into it. But yeah, I have her, and Hannah, I think, is her little partner in crime. And they do manage against some pretty nasty odds to make it out alive.
Nice. It's interesting. Things turn out okay, not great, just okay. So we might get a series out of this one. Yeah, that is funny. Oh, goodness. So do you think there are any lines in the sand that writers should be aware of when you're thinking? So when you write, do you think of your audience? And if so, are you thinking like, oh, if I cross this line, it might turn off readers, or this is too much for my own taste, or,
I probably self-throttle a bit, based on some of the other Dark Fuse books that are out there. I mean, they're not, gore fests, but they can be more gory than mine. And I think a lot of the Dark Fuse fan base likes that. And mine tend to be less gory and a little bit more what if this happened, and conspiracy oriented, and I think there's an audience for it. I'm not real. I mean, not that there's no blood in my books. Trust me on that. But I just,
right.
I kind of shy away from just blood after blood after blood. It has to be like, if somebody's getting killed, it needs to mean something, and sometimes I'll back off on some of the detail. Like I said, in the one that's under consideration right now, the one about the for-profit prisons, that is definitely my darkest. There is a scene in there where one of the characters, who's a nice guy, he doesn't deserve what's happened to him. He winds up in one of these prisons, and he's sexually assaulted in his cell. And it was just like the most horrible thing I've had to write, and I backed off the detail. You can surely know what's happening, but I just couldn't really get into the blow-by-blow description. It's bad enough, and I didn't feel the need to go further to express what was going on.
Well, I think that's often the more artful choice, to leave some gaps there so that the reader can fill it in with their own imagination. And, some things are better left to the imagination as well. I appreciate that choice.
Scarier.
Yeah, and they can be a lot scarier, much more affecting too as a reader when you're left to keep filling in those gaps, because the mind does want to fill in the gaps. It's sort of like water is going to keep leveling itself out. So if you put the book down and you go away, you're going to keep thinking about that scene, and you're going to keep processing it, for better or worse. Yeah. So you said your short stories, your short fiction is more of the paranormal horror. So do you feel the same way with that type of dark fiction as you do about the biotech thriller?
As far as boundaries?
In terms of gore, boundaries.
Yeah, same with the gore. I can only go so far with it, frankly. I mean, there's some, reasonably gory scenes in Skin Shift. He's not a very nice man at all. No, he's a very bad man, but not insanely so. I kind of back off being just lovingly giving every piece of blood and every piece of flesh flying off or whatever. It's just, that's not my thing.
Right. Well, you said that there is an audience for Dark Fuse's publications that wants the gore and the blood and stuff. So do you feel like you're different than most horror writers that way? Or is there kind of, how do you categorize this? Because I'm not a huge reader of horror, so.
I think there's like a continuum of it, and there's, the kind that just doesn't go into blood and gore at all and is more cerebral and probably the more old-fashioned type writers, from days back. And then there's like the extreme stuff, and I just no. And I'm kind of like maybe somewhere in the middle. It has to be really key to the story, not just there goes another head blowing up or whatever. So I'm a little more Twilight Zone-ish, in my speculation.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay.
A little bloodier than Mr. Serling, but not terribly.
Yeah. I'm still processing the idea of genre parameters. So would you say that's a distinction between dark fiction versus straight out horror fiction, is going more toward the cerebral Twilight Zone-y stuff and less toward the slasher style? Yeah.
And even with Stephen King, though, I mean, he's got blood, but he's not like slash. So,
right.
It's more that middle of the road where, it's happening, but it's not just the whole point of it. And there's some that's the whole point of it. And Dark Fuse doesn't go that far over, but that would not be my bag.
Yeah, mine
or just
neither.
the gross out stuff, just for the sake of grossing out. Like, no, it has to be really integral to the story. And reasonably tastefully done.
I agree.
And it sounds as if your background as well, with such a long career in IT and then switching into law, has helped you really put that sort of fine detail and obviously with some sort of medical training in there as well, or initial education. How do you think that's brought? How's that influenced your voice?
Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of a mishmash of all those things in a way. Yeah. And, I have to be careful too. Sometimes now, because I do legal writing, obviously, I have to put that side of my brain over somewhere else and remember, no, description. We need description and fullness of the, of the experience. And I got the other side of my brain going. So, yeah, but I do think there has been an influence that stays put, though, and people comment on it when they do reviews. And, IT, you have to be fairly precise in things, duh. Mm-hmm. And in law, you better be precise or you lose the case. You may still lose it, but, and medical is, medical. And so I have kind of a crisp style. I try to write pretty spare sentences that aren't, and my paragraphs are actually on the short side because I'm just trying to, here we go, and still give enough description so it's a nice full experience for people to read. And I like to write very visually. When I'm really on, I'm seeing it in my head while I'm typing, and it gets very visual. And I like when that's really great when that's happening. So people have said, I can see I'm right there in it, but it's also very clean text. It's, it doesn't go on forever. And because I have the shorter paragraphs and move along like that, people say is very fast paced because of how I do it. So yeah, I guess I do have a bit of a voice that I've developed.
You'd sort of worry a bit anyway, wouldn't you, if it went the other way around, that your fiction started to creep into your legal writing at work?
Well, sometimes I do that because if you write a complaint and you're trying to make sure your client sounds really sympathetic and that this is a terrible situation, and you get to introduce the case, people like how I do that.
Yes.
And
yeah.
And here's a graphic description of the murder scene.
Yes. It's kind of how to tell a story. There is storytelling in legal writing, and you don't want to go off into flowery words, but I think it gives a flow to it that helps. Yeah,
definitely.
Any chance of legal thrillers coming out then at some point?
Well, the incidental findings that's coming out in the summer is kind of it's both.
Oh, yeah, you should say yes. You said the alternative, yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's not like heavy courtroom drama, but it's lawyers doing. They never make it to the courtroom. They settle.
Oh,
give away.
Easy.
They take it out with their lives, which is also important.
Right.
Yes.
Now, you said you write kind of spare because you're thinking about, well, there's your voice, but also you're thinking about pacing. You're conscious of that as you write. So what elements are you conscious of when you're plotting your stories?
Oh, plot.
Yeah, plot.
Versus the pantster.
Or even if you don't outline, just are there elements that you feel have to be in these books to satisfy genre considerations or audience expectations, or just things you enjoy writing into every story? Or are you always looking for a twist?
Yeah. Lots of things, actually. I throw a few Easter eggs in there that people have no idea that don't really matter to the plot. They're just little secret things I put in just for my own self-satisfaction. But I'm really kind of fanatical, if you will, about continuity. I'm just crazed. I cannot stand it if there's no continuity. So that is one reason I outline very carefully before I even start the first draft. And I look at that outline and try to make sure. I mean, obviously I'm going to miss things and there's editing and, that happens. But I try to make it as clean as I can starting out. And the reason for that, particularly in my novels, because there's a lot more words than in a novella. Duh.
Right.
Wow, that was profound.
It's true, though. It is a truism.
But the nature of my novellas, there's causality typically in the biology of them. And it's, something needs to percolate for a while before it becomes evident, or the contagion has to take a little bit before it starts to show. And so I'm really careful about my timelines, and sometimes it makes me nuts. And I really want to start writing the story, but I know better than to write it before I've got it down. Like, it takes this long for reasonably, obviously we're in a fantasy world, but, nobody's going to believe it if somebody contaminates the bus and everybody's dropping dead in 24 hours. No. So she has to contaminate the bus, and then we have to let some weeks pass by. And so I have to make sure that that's kind of clear so that it, feels right. And the causality in Broken Chain, it took a while for the bad soy to do the thing to the cows, for the people to eat the cows, and then for somebody to put two and two together, because why is this happening in Minnesota? It was happening.
Oh, no.
I sit in Minnesota because there's such beautiful farmlands, outside the Twin Cities. There's a scene in there where she's going to the vegetarians at the Twin Cities for the doctor visit, and they don't know what the heck's going on, and she's driving back to this little town where this is all starting to happen. But it has to have some a bit of reality to it. To again, I like to use a bit of real and then kind of plot it out so that it makes some sense. I guess I should probably try to have happier endings a little bit more often.
It depends. I mean, that's a matter of taste, isn't it? Yours and your readership as well. So I don't know. I don't think that's a requirement of any story, except maybe romantic comedies. You aren't going to get away with a downer of an ending in a rom-com.
Yeah, I also think that's part of what your expectations are from dark fiction and horror, is that unlike a thriller where you expect the protagonist to solve things somehow, maybe come out scarred, but in horror and dark, you always know there's some propensity that it could just go so horribly wrong that it's that
right,
stuff happens.
Right. And I think too, having that loose end at the end of the book is maybe a requirement of dark fiction, because you want the reader to keep thinking he's still out there, it's still going to get me, or whatever the thing was, whatever that problem was, it's going to crop up somewhere again sooner or later. So you've got that threat, maybe not as imminent, but it's still present in our lives.
Yeah,
I definitely. Freddy's back factor.
Yeah.
I was
I've
thinking
definitely done that, and most of them, I'm sitting here ticking through them. Like, yep, I did that in that one where it's gonna come back. Yep, that one too.
You're an evil schemer.
Yeah. And I also try sometimes, I know I did it deliberately with Genesis Code. I don't think it would work so much for Janice because of what happened in the end, but sometimes I deliberately try to leave room for a sequel just in case. And I've toyed with the idea of maybe a sequel to Genesis someday with Dr. Tyler and his evil doings.
Right. Nice. Very cool. Well, I think we're going to wrap up this episode. Any final thoughts or final questions?
I have one question. What do you think is the most fun thing about writing dark fiction?
I get to do whatever I want. And if I want to punish the bad guy, I can do it, which doesn't always happen in real life. So, I like that.
So does it always happen in your books?
No. Or Dr. Tyler wouldn't be around still.
Right. Okay.
But it often happens, but not always. Yeah. And Blockbuster, that guy's still around. Ooh. Yeah.
All right. So we've got a couple of potential sequels there with villains on the loose. Excellent. Well, Lisa, where can people find you?
Oh, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Goodreads. I wish I had more time to spend on there and be more interactive on Goodreads. There's just so much time in the day, unfortunately, and it's really hard, especially, with an independent press or, self-pubbing myself to do, get out there and, interact as much as I'd like to and still get the work done, because I still have book number 3 on track to produce by the end of this year, and I'm just in the first draft, and I know with work and everything else that probably take me the better part of the year, and it's just hard.
Yeah, and you aren't busy at all being a lawyer. What are you talking about, Lisa? Come on, crank that baby out.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, some of them are kind of tough because of all the interrelationships and making the technology fit and the symptoms and stuff, and that can really bog it down for a bit before I can fly,
Interesting. All right. Well, we will put links to your website in the show notes.
Oh, yes. I have a website too.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And we will also have a photo of your new book cover, as well as the show notes, the video. All of it can be found at storyworkspodcast.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.